Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek Into Darkness. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review every Star Trek film 1 week at a time. In this video, I will be covering Star Trek Into Darkness. Okay, so like I did last week, let me begin this review with a quote from Media Studies professor Arnold Blumberg. Last week I quoted him about Star Trek 2009, where he said that was the stupidest movie he's ever seen and it insulted his intelligence at every turn. So, what does he have to say about Into Darkness? Quote, while there are still a lot of flaws, it felt like the characters and the actors in Into Darkness were moving closer to something that felt a bit like Star Trek. There are themes that come up in this movie that finally felt like that's the kind of thing Star Trek would deal with. End quote. It's funny. Yeah, it's funny that, again, my feelings are pretty much aligned with his. So, let me actually start this by getting into my personal experience with this film. So, this film came out in 2013, and I was at film school at the time. And I told you last week when I saw Star Trek 2009, I was Phantom Menacing at first. I was convincing myself I liked it because I wanted to like it. But by the time this film came out, which is 4 years later, I'd come to the realization, I faced facts, I faced reality, that Star Trek 2009 was a giant piece of garbage. So, when this film was coming out, I was not at all interested in it. I didn't follow up any, I vaguely read some news articles, oh, there's a new Star Trek movie coming out, and it's got Benedict Cumberbatch in it playing a villain named John Harrison, but everyone thinks it's Khan, but he's denying it. That's pretty much all I heard, but it was mostly in passing, because I was really not interested. I was so disinterested in this movie. It was the only Star Trek film in existence, actually, where I was really apathetic to it, and I had absolutely positively no intention of seeing this movie whatsoever, because I didn't think this J.J. Abrams reboots are not Star Trek. It's just a shameless cash grab. That's the impression I got after the first film, which I thought was a giant piece of garbage, so I had zero interest in seeing this film. So when it came out, I barely even noticed. It was because a couple friends at film school, they went to the midnight showing of this film, and they invited me to go, and I was like, no thank you. I'll pass. I have no interest in seeing another J.J. Abrams CGI diarrhea fest. And they came back the next day, and they were like, oh, that film sucked. And I was like, of course it did. Of course it sucked. It's J.J. Abrams. They're like, no, well, actually, I liked the first one. I'm like, what? You like that giant piece of shit? But anyway, they said it sucks, so I was like, yeah, of course it does. It's J.J. Abrams' diarrhea fest. It's shameless, shitting all over the Star Trek legacy. Of course it's gonna suck. But one day I was in town, and I had something to go to in 3 or 4 hours, so so there was no point in me walking home, because it would taken 2 hours just to walk home and back, and so it would have been pointless. So I thought, well, I have some time to kill. Why don't I just go see a movie? And I went to the theater, and it just so happened Star Trek Into Darkness was playing at the right time. So I was like, screw it. I'll go ahead and waste 2 hours. I know, just to see just out of curiosity more than anything else. I wanted to see how crappy his J.J. Abrams' next, shitting all over the Star Trek legacy was. And I was hopefully it wouldn't make me too mad, but let's see this and just see what it's like anyway. So, I went and saw it, and to my everlasting surprise, I really enjoyed this film. Now, to paraphrase the great Senator Vreenak, when I came into the theater to watch this film, my opinion of J.J. Abrams' Star Trek was so low that it would have to work very hard indeed to disappoint me. So, that's actually kind of a good place to be. where my expectations were absolutely on the floor. They were like under the ground. I had zero expectations that this film would be good. And when your expectations are that low, it actually makes it easier for a film to impress you, because it doesn't have to do a whole lot. It just has to be fairly decent in order to be like, wow, that's better than I expected it to be. And that's what happened with Into Darkness. Now, the funny thing is that a lot of, especially nowadays, you'll see a lot of YouTube reviews and comment reviews that bash this movie. A lot of Star Trek fans seem to voice their opinions. There's a lot of YouTubers who I like their material, I respect their opinions, and I watch a lot of their videos, and pretty much all of them bash this film and don't like it. Yet they do like Star Trek 2009. And in particular, there's the channel Screen Junkies, which I'm a huge fan of. I watch pretty much every video of theirs that they release. There's one of the main guys there, Dan Murrell. He considers himself a Star Trek fan, although he's more of an original series Next Generation guy. He didn't really watch into the other stuff as much by his own admission. He loved Star Trek 2009, and he hated Into Darkness, and he constantly rails at Into Darkness every chance he gets. And I'm going to be honest here. Like, when I first got the idea to do these reviews of every Star Trek movie, it was mainly just so I could do this film. This was the main film I wanted to do, Into Darkness. But I thought, instead of just doing Into Darkness, I might as well do every Star Trek film in order. Might as well, because I have stuff to say about all the films. But this is the main one I wanted to do, and it's mainly because watching stuff like from Dan Murrell or any of these other YouTubers who constantly bash this film, I very strongly disagree. And I never really talked about this much on my channel before, because most of the times I talked about Into Darkness, I was just lumping it in together with 2009 and saying, oh, these reboots suck and J.J. Abrams suck. But to be honest and to be fair, like, I actually mainly, all my vitriol and hate is mainly just focused on that first film. The second one, although not perfect and it does have flaws, which I'll get into shortly, I don't hate as much. I really don't think it's bad. Now, here's the thing about it, though. Even though there are a lot of people, as I say, like YouTubers and other Star Trek fans who like to bash this film, generally speaking, it was well received. Not just critic-wise, but audience-wise. If we go to Rotten Tomato, the score for critic score for this Rotten Tomatoes is 85%. Certified fresh. That's a good rating. Audience score, well, you think, well, that's the critics. What about the audience? Audience score went even higher. 90% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. So, well, that's Rotten Tomatoes. Their system's a bit flawed. Okay, so let's go to Metacritic. What is Metacritic that uses a different system rather than just fresh or rotten? 72%, or 72 out of 100 for the critic score. Overwhelmingly positive reviews. Oh, okay, well, what about the audience score? 7.7 out of 10. Again, almost mostly positive. And then if we go to IMDb, is also 7.7, which is entirely users who use it. So, I mean, it's not the best thing ever. It's not like an 8, but for those averages, like a 7.7 is actually pretty high. It's considered a really good score. And as I said, Rotten Tomatoes is 90%. So, it could be a case of a vocal minority who didn't like this film, who were offended by this film. Now, I say that, and some people say that about The Last Jedi, but The Last Jedi has like 50% or 52% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, I know some people argue that the score was that fans created multiple accounts and they so they fucked up the score and it's not reliable, but we don't know that for sure. I take it at face value that at the very least The Last Jedi is a very polarizing film that fans disagree on, and there's no denying that there's a very large chunk of the fan base who hate that film with a very strong passion. So that is a more polarizing film, but that does not seem to be the case with Into Darkness. Into Darkness, it does seem to be truly the case that there is a vocal minority that don't like this film, where the vast majority of audiences and critics did like it. Now, that being said, if I looked at the same scores, the Rotten Tomatoes scores, Metacritic scores, and stuff for Star Trek 2009, they'd be even higher. And so I am very much aware I am totally in the minority that thinking that film sucks. Although I do know other people, and I quoted Arnold Blumberg as a good example, who also agree with me that the film. In fact, when I made a couple of videos in the past bashing Star Trek 2009, I got a lot of supporting comments, like a lot more than I thought I would. People like, of course that movie sucks. So I'm not completely alone, but I'm definitely in a minority. I won't deny that. But that's not my point. My point in bringing up these, Rotten Tomatoes scores or whatever, is to say that the feeling that Star Trek Into Darkness sucks, even though we hear it a lot. We hear a lot of videos, a lot of fans talk about it, is in fact a minority opinion, just like my opinion on Star Trek 2009 is also a minority opinion. Take that for what it is. That doesn't mean the movie's good. It doesn't mean it's bad. It's just talking about popular opinion and just saying that the perception that this movie is hated by the majority of people is not a correct or very accurate assessment. But at any rate, let me get more into my feelings of Into Darkness. Now, I did like this better. As I mentioned, I liked it better than the first Abrams film, the Star Trek 2009. So why did I like that better? First of all, I want to get into the concept of a parallel universe story versus a shameless reboot story. And I think that is the main difference between Star Trek 2009 and Star Trek Into Darkness. To me, Star Trek 2009 is a shameless reboot, and Star Trek Into Darkness is a parallel universe story. I know I'm on shaky ground here, and I know it's a very subjective distinction, but in my mind, that's kind of how I see it. And also, the other trend I should mention is that a lot of people I know who do like Into Darkness, like my brother, for example. When I saw Into Darkness and I said I liked it, I emailed my brother and I'm like, he also had no intention of seeing this film because he thought 2009 was a giant pile of garbage. And when I said, hey, you actually should see Into Darkness, it's actually better than 2009. He did, and he's like, you're right. I don't think he liked it as much as I did, but he did say it was definitely not as bad as the first one. And it seems to me that's a common perception from people who liked Into Darkness is that well, let me rephrase that. If people who hated Star Trek 2009 seem more likely to like Star Trek Into Darkness more. Generally, that's just a vague term. It doesn't apply to everyone, of course. I know there's a lot of people who love both films. That's probably, they make up the majority, actually. But, yeah, I would say, generally speaking, a lot of people I know personally who hated Star Trek 2009 like Star Trek Into Darkness better. And I do think that does, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and I'll get to that throughout the review, but it ultimately has to do with, as hating that film, the 2009 one, we had low expectations coming into Darkness, so it was a bit easier for us to like it, whereas people who loved Star Trek 2009, they had very high expectations, and what they got was something very different, so their high expectations weren't met. Very simple, but there's more reasons, which I'll get into shortly. But anyway, let me get back to this parallel universe versus shameless reboot concept. Like, what do I mean by that? Well, so, as I talked about in the Star Trek 2009 review, the concept of the Kelvin timeline irritated me, like I was punching a pillow and cursing. It pissed me off because it was just an excuse that the writers gave to wipe clean any sort of established universe or canon so they can do whatever they want with Star Trek. And what they did in 2009 was actually not true at all to the spirit of Star Trek, and it makes sense. So it's obvious to me that they were just stealing the names and the titles of the established franchise in order to make the break in the dough, but they just wanted to make their generic space movie that had absolutely nothing to do with Star Trek. So they were using the concept of alternate timeline or parallel universe as an excuse to accomplish that goal of just rebooting something in order so they could use the established names in order to do something different and new that would appeal more to mass audiences than Star Trek has in the past. Whereas Into Darkness actually has the Blumberg quote I quoted earlier, and first it actually felt a bit more like Star Trek, but it felt like a parallel universe. And that's the thing, like a lot of the criticism leveled at this film, a lot of people hate this film, will say this is just a rehash, rip-off of The Wrath of Khan, because they're having Khan again, and they do the same things from The Wrath of Khan, but flip their perspective, like, you know, the scene where Spock dies at the end of the car, and he's behind the wall, and Kirk puts his hand up. They do the same, but in reverse, where they have Kirk die, saving his ship by going into engineering, exposing himself to radiation, and they have Spock yell Khan instead of Kirk yell Khan. So a lot of people who liked 2009, they saw that as an original piece of good science fiction. They went into this film and was like, well, this is lazy. They're just rehashing what's already been done before, and it's not this original masterpiece that the 2009 film was. I know it hurts me to say those words, but I'm quoting other people. It's not my opinion. But anyway, that's sort of their their mindset, their perspective going into it is that I want something original and fresh, but they're just being unoriginal, just rehashing what has been done before in a shameless attempt to appeal to mass audiences. Whereas my perspective of it, as a Star Trek fan, someone who's been like, here's the thing, I love like parallel universe and alternate timeline stories. Like some of my favorite episodes, Mirror Mirror, Yesterday's Enterprise, Parallels, I think, yeah, you could say Year of Hell as well. They deal with this alternate timeline parallel universe, and a lot of people actually bashed Year of Hell, the Voyager two-parter, because it gets all the events that happen and it get erased by the end of the episode. So what was the point? Where I disagree, because it gives you a mindset of what these characters would be like in a different situation. In fact, the episode I would compare Into Darkness into the most is In the Mirror Darkly from Star Trek Enterprise, that two-parter, because that took place entirely in the Mirror Universe and showed the perspective of what these Mirror Universe characters, so we didn't get our prime timeline characters, prime universe characters at all. It was entirely in the Mirror Universe. And so that's how I look at Into Darkness. I don't look at it as, oh, they're just rehashing Khan and just doing Khan again and not doing something original. I see it as as I said, it's like a cover band. It's just presenting, but from in Star Trek perspective, it's a parallel universe story. It's showing, well, this is a different parallel universe, instead of just being a shameless reboot where they use the concept of parallel universe just as an excuse to do whatever the fuck they want and be lazy writers. Here, it actually feels like a parallel universe story. It feels like something like Parallels or In the Mirror Darkly, where we see a different parallel universe where events would have played out differently and how things cascade. Like In the Mirror Darkly, it starts the episode with the version of First Contact when Zefram Coffer first meets the Vulcans, but it's the Mirror Universe version where apparently history went down a bit differently, like maybe Hitler won World War II or something like that. So instead of things going down the way we knew they go down, Zefram Coffer kills the Vulcans and they take the ship, and that spirals forward. And so it creates this totally different, universe than what we're used to. And I feel like Into Darkness did that, because it explained itself why it's basically, it is doing Wrath of Khan again, but it's like seeing a parallel universe version of Wrath of Khan. And I actually find that really fascinating, just like I found In the Mirror Darkly, seeing some of the events of our, that we experience in later track, like meeting the Gorn and other stuff, and how that's done differently because it's a different universe. But in that way, it actually resembles probably more the episode Parallels, which I know some people don't like that episode, but that's one of my favorite episodes of Next Generation, where Worf goes into a bunch of different parallel universes. And the thing, well, that's kind of more similar to Into Darkness, because it's not, the Mirror Universe is more of a totally different parallel universe. Like, nothing's the same. They're all like evil, mustache twirly, where some of the universes that Worf visited in parallels are very similar to the one we're familiar with. It's just things went down slightly different, so it cascaded, and so we get stuff like Worf being first officer because Picard died, and Riker took over as captain, or Worf marrying Troy, or or maybe the Cardassians actually being friends with the Federation, the Bajorans are the enemies, and little things like that, which. So it's not as jarring as, say, like a Mirror Universe. It resembles, and especially some of the universes Worf went to were very similar, just had really tiny differences, like a painting was over there instead of over there. And that was great. I love that concept. And so Into Darkness feels a bit more like that, where this universe is actually very similar to the one we're familiar with, but there are key differences, and it's spanning from the destruction of Vulcan. And I love how they explain it outright why one thing cascades to another, because the destruction of Vulcan made people in Starfleet, and more importantly Section 31, a lot more nervous and a lot more sort of war hawky and preparing for war against the Klingons, and wanting to be more militarized because of the destruction of one of the key Federation worlds. And that makes all the fucking sense in the world. And that led to them exploring the galaxy more, and so they discovered Khan earlier than what they did in the Prime timeline, instead of Kirk discovering him, because they're just exploring. These military Section 31s are the ones who discover him, and they decide to exploit that, use that as the weapons, because they're in this whole militaristic mindset, and so that leads to them using Khan, and then he ends up rebelling against them, of course, because he's a super genius, and he's unleashed, and we get this whole thing. And so, and like any good parallel universe story, there are, even though there are key differences, there are similarities. So events go down pretty much the same way they did, like, say, in Mirror Universe and Deep Space Nine. All these characters like Dax and Bashir and all, they all end up at Terok Nor, or Deep Space Nine. Anyway, like, some things are just, and that's always been the key to a lot of these parallel universes, that some similarities just happen. And so with this, we get the different versions of Wrath of Khan, where Kirk sacrifices himself to save the Enterprise instead of Spock doing it, because that's the way we did it, because this whole parallel universe was set out differently, but it's similar to what happened in the Prime line, but different, if you follow what I'm saying. So I actually don't think this is a ripoff of Wrath of Khan. I see it as more of a parallel universe retelling, much in the same way as like Parallels or something, and so in that way I find it fascinating. I mean, sure, you could go meta and say the reason the writers and producers wanted to do this is so they could, wreak off the success of Wrath of Khan, and of course, that's true. But I think just from a writing standpoint, I think the way they execute it actually really works. And I would argue, and I went into this last week, that the Star Trek 2009 actually is more of a ripoff of Khan. That is more offensive to me, actually. And that's where I disagree with a lot of people who like to bash this film for just being a ripoff of Khan. Well, I don't think it's a ripoff of Khan. I think it's a parallel universe. It's a retelling. It's a putting a different spin on the Khan story, whereas 2009 is a ripoff of Khan, because they are not admitting that they're ripping off Khan. They're not retelling the story. They're just taking the key elements that made Wrath of Khan popular and just spitting it out again, redoing it. And I talked about Nero last week, about how he's just a cardboard, cliched, lesser version of Khan, where his wife died and so he's out for revenge. It's just, he's a lazy written version of Khan. And then you can also get into Nemesis, which I did like, but it's obvious that they were also ripping off Spock's death scene and stuff, and that was more shameless in that film than it was in Into Darkness, because they were presenting it as something new, and that's the key difference, is that Into Darkness doesn't present it as something new. It's honest, it presents it as a parallel universe, as a different version of the same events, whereas 2009, Nemesis, Insurrection, Generations, they are all just stealing from Wrath of Khan shamelessly and not admitting it. So for me, that is actually much worse, especially the whole Nero thing, 2009. I think that is the worst, most shameless ripoff of Wrath of Khan in existence. This is, I don't even see it as a ripoff of Wrath of Khan, to be frank. Even though I can understand that perspective, I see it as a parallel universe retelling in the same light as the episode parallels or in the Mirror Darkly. Like, when I was in the movie theater and they got to the scene where Kirk sacrificed himself and the you know, the radiation or whatever, and Spock yelled, "Khan!" I loved it. I had like goosebumps all over. I was tingling. I was like, yes! This is such an awesome homage to the Star Trek that I love. But now, getting back to the difference in perspective is because I never took this film seriously, because I hated Star Trek 2009. I never thought this would be a good original film. I always thought it would be just a shameless piece of shit shadow of what Star Trek is. So to see them actually just doing this homage to Star Trek and not something original, I enjoyed, because I never expected anything from this film. And so I didn't mind the fact that they were just taking the time to repeat what was done before but do a different spin on it, because that's better than the piece of shit that they did in 2009, which is a different perspective from people who love Star Trek 2009, because they saw that as this original great piece of work, but instead we just get a retread of another film in this film. So that's, I can understand that perspective, but I totally do not share it. Anyway, other reasons why I like this film better than Star Trek 2009. And this is the main thing for me, because I was watching this review last night and it said, oh, it's no denying that the script in 2000 and Into Darkness was poorly written, and the script of 2009 was a lot more tighter. I'm like, what? What? Am I in Bizarro World? I'm in the parallel universe now. What the hell are you talking about? The script in 2009 was a fucking mess. It was all over the place, and I went talked about this last week. It's like, oh, he's the captain, he's the first officer, oh, they're all cadets, they're all going on this mission, all the ships are destroyed. It's just blur, 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 blur. It was one of the most poorly written scripts, constructed stories I've ever seen, whereas Into Darkness is much tighter. It is much more logical. It flows a lot better. First of all, let me talk about the intro scene, which I actually love. I thought that was a great intro scene to the film, a great way to start the film. It felt like Star Trek, where they're on the planet trying to help this primitive culture. You know, they're making the volcano inert, and the fact they're doing this against the Prime Directive shows that is so Kirk. That is the essential Kirk. He fucked the Prime Directive. If I'm going to save people, I'm going to save people. And so it's so true to Kirk's character. And the way they played it is so perfect setup for establishing the Kirk and Spock relationship, and how Spock was willing to sacrifice himself in the volcano, but Kirk wouldn't let him, and how it created this dynamic, this sort of feud between them. And that flowed into another, and then it totally made sense by the end of the film, where Kirk sacrifices himself. I mean, the way they set things up and pay them off is just classic scriptwriting 101. So much better in this film than it was in 2009. This whole film flows so much better from A to B to C, and just makes so much more sense. But more than that, like, if anyone ever says, what is the one thing about Star Trek Into Darkness that you like the most, what is the one characteristic you think of first? I would say the character story. Character stories is always very important to me. In Star Trek 2009, the character stories were all over the place. They had good setup, but they all went to shit. They didn't make any sense. It seems like Kirk and Spock hated each other, and all of a sudden they liked each other, which it made no sense whatsoever. You didn't get any feel of who these characters were. This film, the Kirk and Spock relationship, was done so well. I would say that is the number one thing I like about this film, because I remember watching this YouTube video from someone who hated this film, and they're like, I know some people liked it, but don't tell me you liked it because of the action. Don't action isn't everything. Action, 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 action. But actually, to me, action is nowhere near the reason why I like this film. In fact, if I were to compare some of the action scenes side to side with 2009, I would actually say the 2009 action scenes are better. Some of them anyway, but I'll get more into that later. So it has nothing to do with action, why I like this film. It's because of the character stories is the main reason why. I really got the sense that Kirk and Spock had a genuine relationship, that they were best friends. I did not get that sense at all in 2009. Their relationship there made no sense. Here it was so perfectly set up, where Kirk, as I already talked about, saves Spock's life at the start, but then at the end is willing to sacrifice himself, and how the effect that has on Spock and how that enrages him. Like, that to me was perfect. Absolutely love that. That is the reason why I like this film. I think that is the film's highest point, is the character stories, especially the Kirk and Spock relations. Some of the side characters kind of went by the wayside, just like they did in 2009. But the main thrust of the film works so much better in terms of character stories. But another main thing why I like this film better is the villain. Now, I already talked enough about Nero. I can't talk enough about how poorly written, two-dimensional that character was. So this is another case where it's not a very high bar to meet to do a better villain than Nero. But I think they went way higher than the bar. I love Benedict Cumberbatch as Khan. Now, did they need to do Khan necessarily? Would have been better if they did some original villain instead of just trying to redo Khan again? Sure. Absolutely. And was it completely stupid how they hid from the public that it was Khan and were trying to pretend it's just some guy named John Harrison, where they were so transparent that it was Khan, and then they did reveal it was Khan? It was like, yeah, no shit. Yeah, that was dumb. They shouldn't have done that. And the whole thing of him, how they played up the scene where Benedict Cumberbatch is like, my name is Khan. Yeah, that was a bit dumb and over the top, because this version of Kirk doesn't even know who Khan is, so why is he saying it like that? That's all dumb. I totally agree with you guys there. But overall, all that aside, this villain is a great villain. If you forget about his name, Khan or whatever, this is one of the most well-developed, interesting villains in any Star Trek film. And I think I put it up there because of that. He's three-dimensional, he's dynamic, you get his motivations, you understand his plight, and yet at the same time he's evil. Now, I've heard some people who didn't like this film complain that you understand with him too much, and so it feels like Khan is the one in the right and Kirk and Spock are in the wrong. And if that is your opinion, then I think you need to seek some psychiatric help, because it is very clearly established in this film that Khan is a mass murderer. He doesn't mind killing people. He blew up an entire building and killed a bunch of innocent civilians. He crashed the ship in the middle of San Francisco to kill thousands of innocent civilians that had nothing to do with it. Kirk and Spock did not do anything of the sort, and they never would, and their whole point is to stop him from killing a bunch of people. I mean, I guess the perspective that they relate to Khan more is because he just wants to save his crew, and Admiral Marcus is rightfully a douchebag asshole who threatened to kill his crew. And I think they took issue with the fact that Kirk used Khan's crew against him, but like Spock, he saved the crew's life. He didn't just kill off Khan's crew. He took them out of their torpedoes before detonating them. So I completely 100% disagree with that mindset. I think it doesn't really hold any validity, to be honest, because I think the film actually does a really great job of establishing that even though you can understand Khan's plight and his motivations, he is an evil guy. And again, that is the best villain. In fact, I would say the fact that you understand and relate to him and you can almost cheer for him because he's just trying to save his crew is what makes him such a good villain, and what makes him such a good character is that you can relate to him. He's the hero in his own story, but if you look at the bigger picture, he's definitely the villain, because he's just killing people indiscriminately, and ultimately he's a white supremacist analogy. He wants to wipe out anyone who is not genetically enhanced or superior like he was. So he's not a good guy. He is a Hitler type, and maybe the film could have done a better job getting into that more, But I personally got it. I understood that. I understood that this is an evil guy who needs to be stopped, even though you could relate with them. And I think that just makes him an even better character. And Benedict Cumberbatch is an amazing actor. He does an amazing performance here. I'm sorry. I know I get a lot of hate from Trekkies, even though I said this before. I think he does a better job than Ricardo Montalban. I guess acting is a bit of a subjective thing. It all comes down to opinion. If you prefer over-the-top, hammy, or even stage acting, where he goes, Kirk! Then maybe that's your thing. Or maybe you just have the nostalgia glasses on and you prefer because that's what you grew up with, and there's this other guy in more modern times trying to redo what you're already familiar with, and you take offense to that. And I totally understand that. I get that. I'm not putting that down. That's a very valid opinion. But I think, objectively, from an objective actor, any acting coaches or anyone who studies acting would see that Benedict Cumberbatch does a much better villain than Ricardo Montalban did. I'm sorry, but I think that is just a fact. But, so yeah. And I'm not saying, and when I did my top 5 villains, I actually put Ricardo Montalban's Khan ahead of Benedict Cumberbatch. So acting isn't everything, and I totally agree. I do agree that Wrath of Khan is a far, like not even close, is a far superior film, and Ricardo Montalban's Khan is a far superior villain. But facts, Benedict Cumberbatch, better actor. Just putting it out there. Anyway, now, let me get into the use of Section 31. And this is another thing that I was so tickled pink when I first saw this. It's like, ooh, a Deep Space Nine reference in these shameless reboots. Maybe these reboots aren't as shameless as I think. And it's not just a Deep Space Nine reference, because it's not like in, say, Star Trek 2009, where they're just like, oh, Cardassian drink, or oh, Tholian ambassador. It's not just a shameless name drop. It's a major plot point. And it's a plot point that makes a lot of sense, too. Because Section 31 had been established as the shady organization that has existed since the formation of the Federation. So they've been around during this time period. And after the destruction of Vulcan, it makes all the sense in the world that they would get very anxious and more involved in what's going on. Now, the fact that Admiral Marcus just right out tells Kirk about Section 31 is a bit out of character. They're a bit more under wraps and harder to detect than him just casually mentioning it to him like that. But then again, he was planning on killing Kirk anyway, so, you know, I think he assumed he was going to die anyway, so why not tell him? But and I think that's the main thing. And I loved the way it was used. It made total sense. It was like so great that they incorporated this thing established on Deep Space Nine of all shows into this new film. And I loved it. I loved it. I thought it was executed very well. Now, I heard a lot of general audiences and critics who maybe aren't as big of a Star Trek geek as I am, which is fair enough. Most people shouldn't be. Who watch this film complain about this scene because they haven't seen Deep Space Nine. They haven't seen Section 31 established, so they're less familiar with them. So I've heard a lot of complaints that it doesn't seem realistic that there'd be this military organization, and how would they get away with doing all this stuff without getting caught. And like one review in particular I saw was complaining about this and like, you idiots, it's Section 31. Of course they can do this. But I shouldn't blame them, because to be fair, and I've complained about this before, the film itself didn't actually explain this very well, because maybe I had an advantage because I knew the Star Trek lore, I knew of Section 31, so I was able to, well, of course they're going to have this shadow organization, and of course they can make this huge super ship, and of course they're going to be more militaristic if they're under threat after Vulcan is destroyed, because I understand and I know what they are. But someone not familiar with Section 31, and all of a sudden there's this big evil admiral guy doing all these evil things, I can understand how that could come off as a bit more jarring and seem to not fit and be a bit not make as much sense. But I disagree. I just think they lack the knowledge. But to be fair, the film should have gave that knowledge. The film needs to be self-contained. I've already said this before, so it is a valid complaint. Anyway, As much as I've gotten a lot of positives of this film, and that's mainly because, it's not because I love this film. It's not because I think this film is great, but it's because so many people shit all over it. I felt I need to counter that with saying what is actually good about it, but that doesn't mean that I love this film or that I think it's perfect or I don't think it has any flaws, because I think it has a lot of flaws. First of all, even though I do like this film better than Star Trek 2009, it does inherit a lot of the same issues. Now, it does present a somewhat better, more tangible universe than 2009 did, but not entirely. There's still a lot of flaws with it. A lot of carryovers from 2009 where it is just, they're playing fast and loose with the rules of logic, such as when Kirk was demoted from captain, they're sending him back to school. Really? Back to school? He's a Starfleet captain and now he's going back to the academy? I mean, that ties into the whole thing with him getting promoted from a cadet to a captain, which is beyond stupid. So it's sort of rehashing that, and so that part of it I was just like, oh, that's so dumb. But more than that, you have a lot of other issues in this film where the universe doesn't seem quite as tangible. For example, like when the two ships were fighting, and I didn't realize like they were right above Earth until they started plummeting towards Earth. The Vengeance and the Enterprise. And Khan takes the Vengeance and crashes it right into the middle of Starfleet headquarters. So you're telling me that there's no other Starfleet ships that were there to like tractor beam it and stop it or destroy it, choose photon torpedo to destroy it, or there was no defense perimeters, there's no shields around like the headquarters of Starfleet to protect against this sort of thing, that anyone can just take a ship and ram it right into this? Do not buy that for one single solitary second. And for that matter, how come Khan was able to take his little ship and fly it right to the head of Starfleet headquarters where he knew the admirals and stuff would be meeting, and just shoot it? And he was shooting at them for like 3 minutes, and there was no automatic, no beaming systems, no automatic systems, no nothing came, no other Starfleet ships that visually saw this happening and went to intercede. They were just going around shooting and killing all the admirals with no repercussions. That was, don't buy that for a single second, solitary second. That was stupid. And and also, I don't know, but there's a few other things throughout the film like that where it's just like it had that fake universe feel of 2009, but it wasn't as bad as it was in 2009. But anyway, speaking of mistakes in this film, let me now address a lot of major complaints that I've seen about this film. A lot of people who hate this film will constantly complain about that I actually didn't bother me. First of all, one of the major things is the whole transporting across the galaxy thing. Now, to be fair, this did bother me, but nowhere near as much as some of the stuff in Star Trek 2009. So, and a lot of reviews I saw about this film that brought this and other points up and be like, pointing out the flaws in this film, and yet their same reviews for 2009, they were just like, this film's awesome. It seems very, I just don't get it. I just don't get it. I don't understand it. It seems very contradictory to me, because why are they willing to ignore all these flaws in Star Trek 2009, which were obviously way, way worse? and with this film, though, they have to nitpick every little, tiny little detail. When the shit they did with like the product placement, the Kirking promoted to fucking add captain at the Starfleet Academy, and the fucking all the red matter, not even getting into the red matter, and all the other bullshit that Star Trek 2009 did, which was like 1,000,000 times worse than anything done here. They just ignore that. That's fine, but let's nitpick all these little things. Now, as far as the transporting across the galaxy, I mean, they did something similar in Star Trek 2009 when Scotty beamed Kirk and him on board the Enterprise when they were light years away, but Anyway, so my main point is, yes, this is a flaw, and yes, it bothers me, but it's so tiny compared to all the major flaws in Star Trek 2009, so I really don't get why people like to hyper-focus on that while ignoring much bigger fish to fry in the previous film. But the other thing is, even though it was arguably 100 years in the future or whatever, Star Trek Deep Space Nine did establish it as possible to beam from one part of the galaxy to the other because the Dominion could do it. Now you could say, well, that's Dominion. First of all, this is in the future, and this is this unknown species in the Gamma Quadrant who are technologically superior to Starfleet and the Federation, so of course they can beam to one side of the galaxy. That's totally different than someone 100 years in the past having Starfleet having the ability to beam from one side, one planet to another. And that's fair. I actually agree with that. I think that is a fair point. But I'm not saying it's not totally off the walls. But as I said, it is a flaw, but to me it's like small fries compared. Anyway, the other issue people seem to take a lot with this film is now we have a cure for death. Oh, it doesn't matter if people die. We can just cure them. Because McCoy takes some of Khan's blood to save Kirk's life at the end of the film and basically brings him back from the dead. And so people are like, oh, so they can cure the dead. Now it doesn't matter if people die. We can. Now, when I was watching this film last night, I actually realized this isn't nearly as bad as I thought it was, because they made a point of saying that Kirk was not dead for very long. In fact, McCoy has to rush to put his body into cryogenic to freeze it in order to preserve it so he can save it. So it's not like he's been dead for a really long time. So it's not that far outside the realm of possibility. It's not like a catch-all cure for death like a lot of these naysayers are saying, because it only would apply in very specific circumstances. But let me get to my main point, is that Star Trek, the Star Trek universe has done worse than this before. I mean, let's point out the obvious, since this scene is obviously a different take on the Wrath of Khan, where Spock died. Hey, what happened to Spock? He stayed dead, right? No. He was brought back to life. And he was brought back to life after being dead for much longer. He was dead for like months. And of course, they use some Vulcan mysticism, so maybe some people might say, oh, that's totally different because they used the Vulcan Katra and the blah, 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 and it wasn't technobabble that it was in this film. Alright, fine. Well, let's look at Star Trek Voyager then. Star Trek Voyager did an episode called Mortal Coil, where 7 of 9 uses nanoprobes, technobabble, to bring Neelix back to life after Neelix had been dead for, I can't remember how long. It was hours at least. Could have been a day actually, but it was a much longer than Kirk was dead, and he wasn't in cryogenic like Kirk was. And so 7 of 9 has this almighty cure for death. Now you could also say, well, that's Borg technology, so that makes more sense. I don't know. I think that line of thinking, how is the Borg technology any different than saying it genetically enhanced human beings? Because these superhumans like Khan was, that's also like advanced technology or also manipulation. It seems kind of similar, but you could say no, because that was humanity did it like hundreds of years ago, and this is the Borg who are really technically superior. Okay, fair enough. But it doesn't change the fact that Voyager actually did have an end-all be-all cure for death. This thing that McCoy came up with, as I said, is not an end-all be-all cure for death. It couldn't cure all death. It can only work in very specific circumstances. These nanoprobes, they could bring people back who've been dead for hours, who've been dead for days, and they could work under any circumstances. So Voyager actually did have a magical cure for death, and they never used it again. Never ever do we get a touch when people die. They're like, oh, we totally forgot that we have this cure for death because they're not Neelix, so fuck them, who cares? Now, I can already see the counter argument to that, and I've seen this argument before. Some fanboys, well, that's Voyager. Voyager sucks, and Voyager's not really Star Trek. Sorry, but that argument is totally invalid, because regardless of how much you like Voyager or not like Voyager is beside the point. It is Star Trek. It is established Star Trek canon, whether you like it or not. So to dismiss it because you don't personally like it holds no validity whatsoever. So it's already been established that cures for death exist. So this is nothing new. Like I heard someone say, oh, this isn't Star Trek. I'm sorry, my friend, but it totally is. And that's another thing with both these transporting and the cure for death thing, even though I don't think they're the greatest thing ever. Like, this is par for the course, especially the original. Original series does a lot of technobabble magical shit that's convenient for plot. This is nothing new to Star Trek, so I don't really get people complaining about this. Anyway, let me move on from this. Let's get into the music, because I talked about the music in Star Trek 2009, how I loved it in some scenes and some other scenes I don't know. And the music is done by Michael Giacchino, who's a common collaborator with Abrams and the Bad Robot team. And his music for Lost was absolutely amazing. I still hold it as like the best musical score any show has ever had. Like it is so good. And he's gone and done some other great films like Up and other. So he's a really probably one of my favorite composers out there for film and television. But for, as I said, for 2009, they got a bit into the stereotypical, cliche dun dun dun. I actually think the music was so much better here. Actually, they took what was good about the music from 2009 and they left out what sucked. And like the themes they created for the Khan, it did have more of a dark, sort of sinister tone, but it so worked. It was so good. It was so exciting. And there was a scene towards the start of the film where you see this, Starfleet officer who works at the building that Khan wants to blow up. So Khan and his daughter is dying, so Khan manipulates him to planting the bomb to blow it up. That scene was fucking amazing, and the music to that, like the piano tune they played, was so brilliant, because you go back and watch the scene, it relates so much information to the audience without any lines of dialogue. Speaking of Up, it does remind me a bit of that opening sequence in Up, where it goes through that guy's life, where he's in love with his wife and then she dies of old age, where the whole thing they played out with the music and it's no sort of dialogue, and it's so emotionally impactful and so powerful. This scene reminds me of that. It was done so well, where they don't need any dialogue, they don't need exposition. You can just see they're able to pictorially tell a story that this guy has a daughter who's dying, and you can see on his face, the actors did an amazing job with this. All you need to do is look and see the tears in his eyes. You can tell that he has a terminally ill daughter, and that is really tearing him up inside, and you get the emotional impact of that. You get all the information you need to know about that with no dialogue whatsoever, and just the amazing music, the way it was cut, the way it was filmed. I have to give credit to J.J. Abrams. I never said he was a bad director. He's actually a very good director, and this is a prime example of that. This is some really great filmmaking right here. So, yes. So I do definitely have to give props to that. Now, also, some of the action scenes in this film are, just like 2009, are really good. Now, but in 2009, it was just a collection strung together with no coherency. At least these belong to a really great plot with really great characters, and that's what makes them better. But like the scene, for example, where Kirk and Khan are flying over to the Vengeance, like through their spacesuits. Oh, that was such a good scene. That was so intense. Like I said, the same thing about the, the drill over Vulcan scene. That was also a really great action scene. So J.J. Abrams does action scenes great. There's no denying that. But at least in this film, it was attached to great characters and a better story. Anyway, why don't they like Scotty? What does J.J. Abrams have against Scotty? Because in the first film, Scotty doesn't appear until like more than halfway through, and he's barely in it. He just shows up and cracks a few jokes. Here he does seem more like the chief engineer at first, but then like Kirk kicks him off the ship like towards the beginning of the film, and then he doesn't reappear towards the end, so he misses out a big chunk again. Again, they like want to make Scotty disappear. Why do they hate Scotty? And beyond, Scotty actually does have a major part, but that's probably because Simon Pegg helped write the script for that film. He's probably sick of being written off of half the film for every film. But anyway, was Carol Marcus really necessary? Because, again, like, I did like seeing Carol Marcus in the origins of how she met Kirk, and again, this is like the parallel universe version of her, so it was interesting seeing how the parallel universe version of her would react with James Kirk. But other than her being Admiral Marcus's daughter, which added a nice step to her, where he, it added dynamic to his storyline, which, by the way, I really loved Admiral Marcus and his portrayal by RoboCop, Peter Weller. I heard people complain about him. I don't get that. I think he was amazing. But anyway, Carol Marcus, was she that necessary? I don't think so. I mean, I think other than that one scene, she seemed kind of superfluous. Like, at the end of the film, she's shown as being a major member of the crew. She's like, thank you for introducing me into your family, and then and beyond, she's just gone, no explanation. I actually didn't mind that, because even though I liked seeing this parallel universe version of Marcus, I did like actually the Khan reference. Her character actually didn't add anything. Now, I know a lot of people love to pick on and make fun of that scene where they show her in underwear. Ooh, that's shameless sex appeal. Yes, it is. But again, is it worse than anything 2009 did? Like having that green alien in bed with Kirk and having her be naked? And no, it's not. So I don't get why people hyper-focus on the flaws of this film while ignoring the flaws in the other, which are way worse. Anyway, my rating for Star Trek Into Darkness out of 10 is a 7, very good. As I said, like, you might have expected me to give this a higher rating because I'm talking how much I like this film, but as I said, it's not perfect. It has a lot of logical flaws, like how come Starfleet's not able to stop Khan? Why are they sending Kirk back to school? And and how come they're promoting Chekhov, who's just a navigator, to chief engineer? That doesn't make any sense. Surely there's more highly qualified engineers. So this film does have a lot of logical flaws. But, as I said, the character story is great. The story structure actually works way better than 2009. It is rehashing what was already done before, but it does it in a way, to me, which is interesting. It gives that parallel universe Star Trek film that's interesting. But again, the rehash is another reason why this movie doesn't get an 8 or something higher. But still, good film. I think it gets a lot more hate than it deserves, in my opinion. Anyway, that is it for my review of Star Trek Into Darkness. Next week, I will be wrapping up my reviews of the Star Trek films with doing at this stage, what is the latest released Star Trek film, Star Trek Beyond. And then after that, I am going to do a very, very quick video where I rank the Star Trek movies in order from my least favorite to favorite. I'm sure if you've watched these reviews, you could probably guess what that would be. But anyway, I'll get to that next week. Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channels. I do many other Star Trek videos, as well as other videos and other shows like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Babylon 5, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.